This video tutorial is designed and intended for Stage 6 students studying the software engineering course, particularly the topic programming for the web. The content is supplied and taken from the eForge online resource by James King. So the syllabus dot point we're going to cover today is the second one, investigating and practicing how data is transferred on the internet. Now, in the coming lessons, we're going to get into quite a lot of really subject-specific details about data packets and data requests, and we're going to get a lot of technical language. Before we can do that, you really have to get your head around the basics. So today is really the basic concepts. We're not going to be using a huge amount of jargon. There will be a little bit, but in the coming lessons, we're really going to get into the technicalities. So we're looking at web apps here, and primarily what we're doing when we are interacting with a web app, or particularly a user is interacting with a web app. If you look at this diagram down here, the user's hanging out on their browser here, and it's pretty much HTTP, what we call requests, so contacting a server, and that same server putting back a HTTP response. So HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, it's the protocol used on the web to communicate between a web browser and a web server. What we're really going to go through here is what these handshakes look like. The browser to the server, and then the server back. So when a user interacts with a web page, pretty much what they're putting in is a URL. So www.google.com is a URL. Yeah, if you preface that with, and I know when we were doing some of our HTML activities, like a HTTPS at the start, ://, whatever the particular URL is, what happens when a user types that URL into a browser is that it is then translated. What that translation looks like, what those data packets look like, we're going to cover in the technicalities in the coming lessons. But from a high level, that URL is translated into a request for a specific resource that is sitting on a server somewhere, physical, the cloud, or otherwise. That URL could point to, something like a static page, or it could be a dynamic page like a search request or something that's being fetched from the database, for example, if you're logging in. So sending the HTTP request. Once the URL is interpreted, and we're going to break down that interpretation in the coming lessons, it sends a HTTP request, like I said, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, to a web server. Here's what that HTTP request contains. Two things. The requested resource, so if it's a product page, like if you're clicking on a menu and you're clicking, shoes, clothes, like let's just think of an e-commerce one. Shoes, it will pull the product page, that requested resource for all the shoes. The second thing that it's also going to pull is a HTTP header. This is what we're really going to get into quite a lot of detail about in the coming lessons. HTTP headers include metadata about the request, such as what browser is the user on, what's accepted languages, any session cookies that they may particularly have. The HTTP request can be of two different types. It can be a GET request or a POST request. Now, back on your Django project, when you were doing secure software architecture, you would have got some GET or POST errors, or you may have seen this SST. So a GET request is a request to retrieve data, like loading a web page. A POST request is a request to send data. So for example, if you were putting a log on, a lot of people were getting POST issues. That's when you are sending data, like submitting a form, submitting a username and password, something like that. So two different types of requests. GET request or POST request. Each request has like a resource, what it's particularly trying to point to, and a header that goes along with it. After it gets the HTTP request, server processes, it locates the resource, or it processes the dynamic request. So if it's for a dynamic web page, the server might need to run some code, like that's what we were talking about. It might need to run some code in Python or PHP or another language and generate a web page just on the fly based on the information. So you know how we've said high level, it connects to the server and the server runs some code. That'd be when it's trying to process a dynamic request. This often involves, interacting with a web page, with a database to retrieve or update data, You know, if there's a query on car sales to retrieve certain cars within a certain range, within a certain type, when that request gets sent, obviously the web server, when it's trying to pull down those results, will have to run some kind of logic in order to be able to identify a specific type, a specific display for that page based on what you've input. That script is run on the server and that page is sent back to the user. The response from the server, this is the other way. So if you remember back to our diagram here, that we've just done a whole lot of things on requests. Let's go the response the other way. So the response is when the data gets delivered back, it sends a HTTP response. You may get responses and you will probably recognize some of these: 404 not found, or a 500 internal server error. Web browsers usually display that. That means there was a problem on the server. 500's internal server error means something went wrong on the server, couldn't do it. 404 not found means that page does not exist anymore on the server. So they may be ones that you've seen before. 200 is an okay response. It's probably only something that you'd use on a higher level when you were testing response times of pages. When your HTTP request is usually successful, or your response is successful, you just get whatever you've requested. You don't often get 200, but there is a status code to say it has been successful. It's often used a lot in testing. The response data is usually a HTML document, but like we said, it could include some JavaScript stuff for data-driven web apps. The HTTP response headers also, so in the header that comes through in the response, there's three things. There's a status code, the response data. I didn't indent this very well, apologies. I'm just actually going to indent it for you right now on the fly in the middle of this tutorial so you know exactly what I'm talking about here. See if it indents okay, and then I'm going to indent this. This is really poor, apologies. May need to re-record this, probs won't. So there's three things: the status code, the response data, which is typically the document you requested, and it comes with a header. So it gets sent with a header. The response comes with a header. Additional information like content type, metadata kind of stuff. The browser renders the web page and presents it to the user. So what your browser is actually doing there is, it's not just go, oh, because we've always said, and it loads the page. This is what it actually does. The browser reads the document and determines the structure of the web page. It loads any additional resources that are referenced, like a CSS file, images, etc. And then if within that script or within that page there is client-side scripting, so there's JavaScript embedded within that, not just code that was running on the server, say there's some internal scripting included in the HTML, it executes that. And that's it, guys. That's the high-level understanding of HTTP responses and requests. Next lesson, we're going to get into a little bit more of the technical and what those data packets look like.